The term dark tourism, on which, as has already been noted, a number of papers at this conference will focus, has gained particular currency in the last 2 decades in particular across a wide range of disciplinary fields, especially, and I go back to a point I've made already, in English language scholarship. It's been used to describe, and often, as Mike said, to understand in historical perspective, the opening up by the international heritage industry for public benefit in terms of education, entertainment, or the facilitation of memorial practices, as well as often for commercial purposes, the opening up of former sites of suffering, pain, and punishment. Study of this supply side of dark tourism has developed in parallel with research into the demand side of the phenomenon, demonstrated most starkly in more informal and spontaneous practices of travel to sites of death and disaster. Now, although less evident in studies of French and Francophone memory and heritage, equivalent terms like tourisme macabre, so macabre tourism, tourisme des catastrophes, catastrophe tourism, tourisme noir, black tourism, tourisme sombre, somber tourism, they're increasingly being deployed to describe the practice and its association with sites of dark heritage in the French-speaking world. And one thing that interests me, and I hope this might come up in some of the other presentations, is the way in which dark tourism and dark heritage manifests themselves differently in other languages, in other linguistic niches, which takes me back to that notion of translatability. So what I want to focus on is precisely around this recent project that Lars mentioned, which itself sought to develop comparative understandings of dark tourism whilst reflecting on what I've just mentioned, that's this translatability of the phenomenon into a range of different cultural and linguistic contexts. The emergence of the approaches we suggested is not, I think, particularly surprising. This was largely a Franco-British project. We had a partner at the University of Tasmania as well. Both France and Britain have been identified with, and in certain cases they've shared, dark, uncomfortable, catastrophic, or disturbing pasts. As nation states, they've created large prison estates, and as colonial powers, they've engaged in the transatlantic slave trade and created penal colonies abroad. Both countries experienced the horrors of 2 world wars, and both have erected memorials to those murdered in genocides. The desire to mark, explain, and reveal the suffering and experiences of the oppressed have created a range of institutions in the wider Anglophone and Francophone worlds, and in former colonies, including Rwanda, Australia, New Caledonia, and Vietnam, which fall into the broad bracket of dark tourist destinations. And as the program for the conference reveals, I think, very richly, places which have come to be associated with this term encompass a really eclectic range of sites. Despite the emphasis on national spaces and national traditions in scholarships, in scholarship in the field, I think again, as ever, there are questions around methodological nationalism and the way in which we need to avoid the pitfalls of that. Dark tourism is in practice often inherently transnational in terms of the range of variables whereby it's regulated, that is, the design and governance of sites, the movement of visitors across national boundaries to access these sites, and the significance of the events or histories these sites commemorate. As a phenomenon, it provides access to entangled national histories and the multiple perspectives on the past to which these give rise. Across much of the literature in the field, a key focus is also on questions of nomenclature and in the conceptual fields this seeks to encompass. Although, as I've already suggested, I do think there's this equal need for attention to the translatability or often untranslatability of these terms and ideas, reflecting these movements between languages and contexts they imply. I begin by acknowledging then, this won't surprise you, that dark tourism remains a contested term, describing an ambivalent and controversial activity dependent on a wide variety of motivations, which illuminate key questions about forgetting and remembering, about mourning, and about justice. Transnational and comparative perspectives offer a way of understanding how competing versions of the past are developed within academic scholarship and are also commemorated within national histories, as well as how they're addressed within different organizational and economic frameworks. And I'm thinking, of course, of the cultural, tourist, and heritage industries. I return, though, to my title, The Ruins of Empire, and begin with a site that, although rather different from the penal heritage locations on which I'm going to focus in due course, underlines the post-colonial dimensions that are also going to underpin this presentation. The tourist wandering a little bit off the beaten track in the Bois de Vincennes in Paris encounters this site of dark heritage, the Jardin Tropical, the tropical garden, location of the 1907 colonial exhibition. It's still home to a number of pavilions in various states of dilapidation, erected for that event over a century ago now. And it's also the closest France has to a colonial statue graveyard. Here, partly overgrown by foliage, languishes the once imposing monument to the glory of French colonial expansion. Sculpted by Jean-Baptiste Belloc and placed at the Porte Dorée in 1931, opposite the official entrance to the colonial exhibition. It was then moved from that site in 1949 to the Château de Vincennes, and finally transferred back here in 1961, in the final months of the Algerian War of Independence, to its original location, where it remains emblematic of the state-sanctioned processes of neglect, amnesia, and marginalization to which the colonial past was, in the immediate aftermath of empire, subject in France. I'm interested in the Jardin Tropical because it serves as a multi-layered place of intersecting forms of dark heritage. It's the site of the human zoos with which colonial exhibitions were associated. It's home of the Institute of Agronomic Sciences, on which the exploitation of many colonies was dependent. And it's a reflection, you see it here, of the post-colonial ruination described brilliantly in this recent book by Anne-Laure Stoller, Duress, by which many traces of empire have been steadily eroded. Though its recent renovation and addition of heritage apparatus is apparent, it's been recast through that as a visitor destination. It functions then as what the French call a site of tourisme de mémoire, memory tourism, a phenomenon associated in particular, but not exclusively in France, with the battlefields of the First World War, but also arguably linked with the related practices of dark tourism, a concept, as I've said, whose French and Francophone manifestations are at the heart of this presentation. So, dark tourism, as I've noted already, was first identified largely by tourism scholars in the Anglophone Academy in the early 90s. Despite, as many have recognized, an initial theoretical fragility, the field has grown exponentially to encompass an increasingly diverse range of disciplines and to impact on other sectors, notably in the English language media, where the terminology of dark tourism is now widespread. Tourist consumption of traumascapes and deathscapes often overlaps with that of memoryscapes, meaning that we have a challenge to unpick the relationship between dark tourism, other tourist subfields, and the broader field of dark heritage. Much of the literature, as you'll know, on dark tourism from its inception has been preoccupied with taxonomies. In part, this has encouraged a nuanced understanding of the phenomenon through the elaboration of alternative terms, often associated with lighter and darker emphases. And I refer you, of course, to Philip Stone's pioneering work on the dark tourist spectrum. In terms of these alternatives, thanatourism, we know, betokens extreme tourist practices associated exclusively with death. At the same time, though, there's been this increasing attention to a series of subfields: grief tourism, slum tourism, disaster tourism, genocide tourism, penal tourism, which interests me, all of which seek to challenge the at times homogenizing emphases of dark tourism and to propose a degree of distinction between separate social and cultural phenomena that are clearly fuzzy or overlapping. These taxonomies tend, though, to perpetuate the singularization of experience at particular sites, to normalize the ways in which narratives of pain and suffering overwrite pre-existing narratives at the places on which they're inscribed, and to reduce the multiple, often competing motivations that bring different visitors to the same place. Now, recent research on dark tourism and affect, and Helene very helpfully addressed this in her opening remarks, has gone some way, I think, to exploring these nuances, and also to challenging one of the initial assertions that dark tourism is to be seen not exclusively but predominantly as a product of postmodernity, of the circumstances of the late modern world. Such emphases on postmodernity have, I think, downplayed some other contexts of dark tourism. Postcolonial engagement has thus far, for instance, been rather limited. Even on a superficial level, there's been little attention, for example, to the negative connotations, especially in terms of race and ethnicity, implied by the use of this word dark. Anthony Carrigan argued that all postcolonial tourism should be considered a form of dark tourism, when the catastrophic histories of violence and exploitation associated with so many postcolonial destinations are taken into account. And such an observation leads to further critiques of current dark tourist practices and the literature that seeks to analyse them. To what extent, for instance, is the fascination with death and suffering on which dark tourism is grounded understood ethnocentrically, with locations in non-Western contexts managed in ways that both respond to Western visitors' expectations and ignore the historical complicity of former colonizing cultures in the events that form the focus of the site. What we might call post-colonializing dark tourism encourages a revision of some of the current genealogies of the practice, and it permits a renewed focus on the implications of travelling to places where the ghosts of colonial as well as national conflicts continue to stalk the land, and where the political subtext of mass tourism is marked by dark histories of oppression and injustice. So, in what remains of this presentation, I'm going to draw on three particular post-colonial locations, very different ones, but all in the former French bagne, the penal colonies of New Caledonia in the Pacific, French Guiana on the South American continent, and Vietnam, to reflect on, first of all, what I've mentioned already, this translatability or untranslatability of dark tourism into Francophone contexts, where its overlap with memorial tourism seems persistent, and then also to consider the taxonomies of tourism that characterize these sites of suffering that continue to form, as I hope I'll show, a network of transcolonial and now transnational dimensions. This is the second and final book cover, but these are two works I've found really, really helpful over the past couple of years in thinking through these issues. As recent work by Anne-Laure Stoller, Claire Anderson, and others has revealed, the French penal colonies form part of a carceral archipelago that's now benefiting from increasing scholarly attention from a global perspective, despite its fragmentation along national lines. French penal establishments functioned in North Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, and Indochina. But the main locations for transportation and deportation were the multiple sites associated with, I've mentioned them already, French Guiana and New Caledonia. Penal transportation to France's colonies emerged in the 1850s, within several decades of the inauguration of the post-revolutionary project of imperial expansionism. And it was to the ancient regime colony of French Guiana that administrators initially turned. The transformation of a colonial space into a penal colony served multiple purposes. It allowed removal from metropolitan France of those considered politically or socially undesirable. It provided, at a relatively low cost, the workforce required to develop the infrastructure required for the exploitation of empire. And finally, convicts during and at the end of their sentences provided settlers to inhabit to inhabit these places, designated as what the French call colonies de peuplement, settler colonies. And so transportation, as is the case elsewhere, was central to a policy of settler colonialism. French Guiana began to receive convicts following an 1854 decree relating to forced labour, just 6 years after the abolition of slavery, and I won't touch on this in this paper, but there are clear intersections between differing strands of dark heritage in these sites. The conditions in the South American penal colony were poor for convicts and officials alike, and the mortality rate was high. The Guyanese penal colony was indeed known popularly as the guillotine sèche, the dry guillotine, as a result of the diseases and other inhumane conditions with which it was associated and which continue to form a part of the heritage apparatus in these sites now. Life expectancy was short, even for those sent to the marginally more salubrious surroundings of the ironically named Isles of Salvation. That's where the Devil's Island was, where Dreyfus would be incarcerated, where Papillon wasn't incarcerated despite the fact he was sent there. The loss of life here was such that from 1864, metropolitan prisoners were sent instead to New Caledonia in the Pacific. Although after the definitive suspension of transportation to Melanesia in 1897, French Guiana continued to function for another 4 decades, receiving civilian transported prisoners, political prisoners, or déportés, as they're called in French, most notably Dreyfus, I mentioned already, but also a number of dissidents from French Indochina. And then there were also the recidivists sentenced for multiple petty crimes, whose transportation had only begun in 1885 under the Third Republic. The decline of the French penal colony became apparent in the interwar period. There were searing critiques of it in the popular press. It was abolished in 1934. That year was not a very propitious one because with the war intervening, remaining prisoners were only repatriated in 1946. Final ones got to Marseille in 1953. So with the French penal colonies, unlike in Australia, we're talking about very recent memory. And I think that impacts on the sorts of tourist practices I'm going to reflect on. In 1965, the French government transferred the responsibility of these islands associated with the penal colony to the Guyanese Space Centre, juxtaposing 2 very different experimental projects, historical and contemporary, and creating an environment that has inevitably impacted, continues to impact, on the emergence of blended tourist and memorial practices in the overseas department today. Space tourism and penal tourism in French Guiana go hand in hand. One of the key challenges of considering the penal colony as a site of memory and tourist destination now involves distinguishing between, on the one hand, the singularized phenomenon that the term penal colony popularly conjures up in the collective imagination, and on the other, the multiplication of sights, moments, and experiences that penal servitude and its afterlives entail. Despite the customary emphases on French Guiana and on New Caledonia, which I'm going to focus on too, there were, as I've said, penal colonies elsewhere in the French Empire, most notably in North Africa, where there were military penal colonies, which operated from the early 19th century. Major penal colonies on which there's very little focus existed elsewhere too. This is Pulu Condor, now known as Con Dao Prison on Con Son Island in southern Vietnam. A location first used by the French for the incarceration of political prisoners from the early 1860s, but the infamous tiger cages there were subsequently used by the Americans for the torture of captives during the Vietnam War. So what we see here is colonization and incarceration entangled in the complex geographical and cultural afterlives of the penal colony, often triggering tensions between social and ethnic groups within individual nations and cultures, or between tourists and the local population, but also generating axes, and this is what I want to focus on, between colonized spaces across the globe. This is, of course, very different from convict sites in Australia, whose inscription by UNESCO on the World Heritage List in 2010 firmly drew narratives of transportation and forced labour into national memory discourses, whilst also ensuring their active integration into the tourist industry. The ruins of the French penal colony, in contrast, have not yet lent themselves to any such form of consensus. They're yet to be fully developed as tourist destinations. And what interests me is the way in which they continue to evolve as sites that encapsulate precisely various strands of post-colonial conflict and contestation. Recent developments in contemporary heritage practices relating to the French penal colonies have nevertheless begun to become apparent, most notably again in French Guiana and New Caledonia. In the former, so in French Guiana, an emphasis on ecotourism and this economic reliance I've already mentioned on the European space station eclipsed for many years the development of any active memorialization or heritageization of the penal colony. Although what we've seen over the past decade is the inauguration of this interpretation center at the transportation camp at Saint-Laurent-du-Maroni, so on the western edges of French Guiana. In New Caledonia, so moving to the Pacific, where the politics of local identity have been more actively foregrounded in these questions relating to the legacies of the penal colony, the heritageization of penal sites is arguably more advanced, although often, interestingly, this has been dependent on the input of community organizations, which has led to a real unevenness in heritage practice. So this is one example. It's on the Grande Île in New Caledonia, halfway up, near Bourail, Fort Teremba, which has been restored and operates as a tourist destination, influenced by a number of sites in Australia. In the capital, in Nouméa, a different association, Témoignage d'un Passé, is continuing to lobby for this building to become a permanent museum of the penal colony. It's in the former bakery of the penal establishments in Neuville. And they're aiming to cater for tourists from cruise ships docked in nearby Nouméa. And by contrast, just to give you a third site, on the Île des Pins, a rather idyllic island off the south of the Grande Île in New Caledonia, destination for lots of cruise ships. With the exception of this site, the Cimetière des Déportés, which is the Communards cemetery for the Communards deported in the 1870s. Those who died are buried here. Most of that site continues to undergo a steady process of post-colonial ruination, because there's largely an apathetic approach to these sites amongst the local population. One of the assumptions of much literature on dark tourism is that sites seen as post-colonial are constructed and animated to cater for an external, primarily Western, visiting public. In many cases, there's truth, I think, in that analysis, as is illustrated in a very different sphere that I'm not talking about today, by a number of slave-related heritage sites in West Africa. I'm thinking of Elmina and Cape Coast castles in particular, from where a local public is actively excluded. Such locations are specifically designed to cater for diverse narratives, diverse visitor needs, leading to the privileging of certain memories and histories over others. And this often creates, and you'll all be familiar with this, a degree of discordance or dissonance between the site and the heritage apparatus that explains it. Dark tourist expectations at sites of historic incarceration foreground the convict experience, for instance, and tend to downplay the contemporary resonance of penal heritage in debates about prison reform. To take the example of the penal colony in New Caledonia, as I've said, it functioned for a much shorter period than its Guyanese equivalent, about 30 years. But its impact on this overseas territory are still palpable. In the capital, Nouméa, there are numerous public buildings constructed with convict labour. There are ruins, as I've shown you, scattered around the archipelago. But memorialisation of the institution, acknowledgement of its place in tourism, remains recent. not least because the initial reaction to the suppression of the penal colony was one of sustained disavowal. And what we've seen is buildings allowed to fall into disrepair or converted into civilian use. These are some in Neuville, which are the psychiatric hospital, the theatre, some of them even form part of the university. What happened in New Caledonia, though, and this is from the 70s onwards, is a number, as I've said, of local associations began to take an interest in the history of the penal colony. And that was a process, and this is where these political entanglements come in, that was accelerated following the violence associated with the rise of Kanak nationalism in the 1980s. And it was in that context that the Caldoche, that's the local New Caledonian population of European heritage, began themselves to look for roots not in France, but in Melanesia itself. Clearly there, echoing earlier shifts in Australia relating to convict ancestry and even to a sense of convict aristocracy. So memories of the penal colony and its potential as a tourist destination in New Caledonia have become a major political issue, and one that achieved some visibility last year in the independence referendum on the island, when Emmanuel Macron chose as a symbolic location for what was his key speech in the campaign, the theatre in Nouméa, a former storehouse of the penal colony, which he described as a lieu palimpseste, a palimpsestic place, and in many ways a rallying point for French Republican unity. As I've suggested, parallels have been drawn between these French penal establishments and those in Australia. And I haven't got time to go into this, but there's a complex relationship between the decline of the latter and the almost simultaneous rise of the former. In parallel to that, there's a need to reflect on their relative status as what Pierre Nora would have called Pierre lieu de mémoire in their respective national contexts. I've already alluded to the registration of the Australian convict sites, or at least 10 of them on the UNESCO World Heritage list. That's not the case in their French-speaking equivalents. There's talk in both French Guiana and New Caledonia of their listing by UNESCO. But what we see is more this struggle between the entropic forces of ruination and a desire to recover and capitalize on, either in terms of memory or tourist income, these memories of the past. And I think one of the most interesting articulations of those tensions is in this text, Guyane, Traces Mémoires du Bagne, Guyana, Memory Traces of the Penal Colony. It's a photo essay by the Martinican novelist Patrick Chamoiseau and the German Algerian photographer Rodolphe Amadi, which looks at these sites, a number of which are beginning to function as tourist sites, but which are still invaded by nature. The point of the collection is that the tourist imaginaries cultivated prior to an actual trip, in this case to French Guiana, often continue to silence or obscure the country's Creole heritage. And the goal of this project is to counter that tendency by underlining the diversity of origins and experiences that the singularizing term convict, the singularizing institution penal colony tend to obscure. So Chamoiseau was interested in this notion of using observation of these sites to discern what he calls memory traces. And he does that through a digressive approach, digressive way of observing and visiting these places. And that leads, in the essay accompanying these photos, to a hostility towards heritage practices. He says, move away from these places, tourism professionals. There's a utopianism to this text, where he sees that actually the curation will be carried out by poets. And it leads us into some of these debates in heritage studies around decay, decline, and the counter-conservation movement, I suppose. What's central to Chamoiseau's text, through this idea of memory traces, which in some ways are rather ghostly and echo with Mike's comments, is the the desire to recover dominated stories and overwritten memories. And that's what I want to finish with, really, because I'm interested in the way in which the emerging heritage apparatus in some of these sites allows us to do this. One of the striking things in French Guiana is the imaginary of those who come to the French department, and the way in which there's a desire on the part of dark tourists there almost to walk in the footsteps of the convicts they heard about in their youth, through literature and through cinema, and in particular through Henri Charriere's Papillon, not so much the novel as the magnificent film from the early 70s, just some of you will know, just remade. Now, Chamoiseau suggests the assumption that such post-colonial sites reflect the singularized histories often inscribed, and white histories usually, inscribed in heritage apparatus relating them, is under increasing pressure. What we're seeing through a post-colonial approach is the creation of links between the recovery of often suppressed voices and silence narratives, and the reconsideration of the ways in which these sites of tourist consumption can be repackaged. What struck me is that heritage practices relating to the French penal colonies tend to downplay, for example, the presence in these sites of colonial prisoners, convicted of civil offences, deported for political reasons, not least from Algeria. And I think that if the penal colony is to be understood as a post-colonial lieu de mémoire and is to be activated as a heritage and tourist site, there really is need to be paid to these transcolonial entanglements. And a site at which this is particularly striking, this is back, I'm dotting around here, this is back actually this is in French Guiana. It's the Annamite penal colony, which functioned for Indo-Chinese political prisoners in the 1930s in French Guiana, which recently has been restored and made accessible as a leisure and tourist destination. More striking, and this is in New Caledonia, so back in the Pacific. This is around the time of Bouraï, a graveyard known as the Arab Cemetery. This is where a number of political and civil prisoners and their descendants from North Africa, particularly from Algeria, are buried. And what's fascinating in New Caledonia, in response to this sort of post-colonial shift, is the way in which there is increasing interest in that axis that links North Africa, Algeria, with New Caledonia in the Pacific. This was, Khaldoun is the word for New Caledonia in Arabic, major exhibition in Paris in 2011. And we're seeing this reflected as well in the tourist apparatus. This is, I mentioned already, the Communards cemetery on the Ile des Pins, a French Republican white site of memory, but where there are actually a number of Kabyle rebels from North Africa buried. There was a rebellion in Kabylia almost the same month as the French Commune. And there's a recognition of these different histories in this site. Now, I'm going to finish with a comment back here, back in Guyana, the Annamite Banya. Because what's fascinating here is that a number of those imprisoned here in the 1930s passed through Pulo Condor in Vietnam. They were mutineers. There was the Yen Bay rebellion in French Indochina in 1930. Those involved in the rebellion were initially incarcerated in this island off Saigon. Pulo Condor, the French called it. Vietnamese now call it Con Dao on Con Son Island. This is where, as I mentioned, the French incarcerated political prisoners, but also these tiger cages built only in the 1940s were then recycled by the Americans for the torture of captives during the Vietnam War. It's a really striking example of the palimpsestic nature of these penal heritage sites. What fascinates me going from the Annamite site in French Guiana, so in South America, back to this site in Vietnam is the cemetery. And I'm going to finish with the cemetery, and intersect a little bit with with Helene's comments. At the heart of the penal colony on Con Son Island is what you see here, Hang Duong Cemetery. A unique place because of the symbolic role it's acquired in narratives of Vietnamese national memory. Now, in contrast to cemeteries at other sites I've studied and visited, Hang Duong is one of the few that's been restored. It's now very carefully curated. It attracts visitors with a wide range of motivations. But its memorial function and its entanglement with the penal colony is very, very different from cemeteries in other penal sites. What happens here is that the histories of torture, deprivation, and dehumanization central to the narratives of incarceration elsewhere on this Vietnamese island are transcended. Hang Duong, as a cemetery, becomes a monument to the ways in which the history of struggle against French and then US imperialism lasted for over a century until the end of the Vietnam War. It covers about 20 hectares. There are about 20,000 graves there. Only 712 of them have been identified. And you can maybe get a bit of a sense there that it avoids the immaculate, regimented appearance of those cemeteries maintained by, for example, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. It's tidy, but not overly so. And the tombs, placed along several meandering paths, radiating out from a central obelisk, coexist with nature. Many visitors come at night, when the site is understandably highly atmospheric, but not for sensationalist reasons, not for the thrill of the dark that motivate many cemetery and prison tours at night, but because this is considered an auspicious time to hold vigils for the dead. So the cemetery becomes a space of socialization then, as well as a place of paying homage. Those visiting burn incense, they offer rice wine, they offer cigarettes to the martyrs. The graves of key historical figures become a focus of attention. But of particular interest is the tomb of Voti Hsiao, teenage guerrilla fighter executed by the French in 1952 at the age of 19 after spending just one night incarcerated at the police station on the island. One of the few extant photos we have of her, this national martyr, it's in effect her mugshot, adorns many of the souvenirs that are on sale on Con Son. So what you see here, Voti Hsiao's tomb, is now a rather elaborate marble construction, but built into it are the more roughly hewn gravestones that originally indicated this site. Torn down and rebuilt, a subtle reminder of the solidarity between the incarcerated, who even in the midst of conflict, when such markers were discouraged, already sought to transform a site of suffering into one of commemoration and even pilgrimage. What we see here, I think, is a disruption of some of the conventional understandings of dark tourism. Crucially also, and I haven't got time to develop this, raising questions around gender. Because in the context of the cemetery, Voti Hsiao has been elevated to the status of secular revolutionary saint. Those coming, you can see here, to pray to her now bring offerings of fruit, flowers, incense, even whole roasted pigs. So, and I will finish here. Hang Duong encapsulates for me, across those sites I've looked at, the specificity of tourism to Con Son, to this island, penal island in Vietnam. Unlike at many other heritage sites in Vietnam, domestic visitors outnumber international tourists by a significant proportion. At the same time, the dark tourism with which much penal heritage is associated coexists here alongside something different, a form of memorial tourism, even religious tourism. In the carceral archipelago, Con Son is distinct from, then, most other penal colonies in that its purpose was primarily, if not exclusively, political. As such, Hang Duong Cemetery, constructed not as something peripheral but central to the island's heritage site, is very different from the other locations I've been talking about. The cemetery is in effect a shrine to the prisoners who died, to the martyrs they became in dying, to resistance, to the struggle against imperialism. It embodies in this site a clear teleology, leading from the suffering in the tiger cages to ultimate liberation and independence. Now, this site includes a souvenir shop and a cafe, meaning that the infrastructure of tourism, of thanatourism, is prominent. But Hang Duong is far removed from some of those dark resting places that Helene alluded to and that scholars of thanatourism describe. It's focused more on what I think is a sort of a commemorational tourism, actively harnessed to national ideology. This meticulously orchestrated lieu de mémoire represents uses of the past that often seem absent elsewhere in Vietnam at the more sensationalist sites like the Cu Chi tunnels. But part of Hang Duong's attraction remains this privileging of highly personal stories through which collective sentiment is challenged. And on Voti Hsiao's grave is this stylized white marble medallion depicting her face. You can probably just see the lips on the portrait are invariably decorated with lipstick, an unexpectedly and subversively gendered touch that underlines the extent to which Han Duong Cemetery continues to speak directly to its primarily Vietnamese visitors, whether they're veterans of the war or those of a generation born after the war and increasingly indifferent towards it. So what I've tried to do is to describe a carceral archipelago stretching across 3 continents that forms a network of sites of emergent dark tourism, vernacular spaces that are continuously negotiated, constructed, and reconstructed into meaningful places. Subject to historical rectification, to memorial redesignation, and even, as we can see here, to forms of sanctification, they encapsulate, I think, a diverse, uneven, and often contradictory range of visitor practices. And in the process, I think they question not only the cross-cultural translatability of the term dark tourism, but also its more general validity in the analysis of the practices of post-colonial tourism itself. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.